Hi, and welcome to the show. I'm Demetria, your host and your Impact Podcast Coach, and I'm here to help you launch and grow your podcast so that you can make an impact on your community. You're listening to Soul Podcasting, episode number 15. And on today, we're talking about how to turn your audio podcast into a video podcast. So it won't be a very long episode because this information is pretty straightforward. And so if you've been podcasting with audio only, there are ways that you can create video or that you can turn your audio podcast into a video podcast. If that's something you're interested in, keep on listening. So this show is sponsored by Faith Media and Impact Podcast Coach, a service that supports women podcasters to boldly share their voices and their powerful messages through the medium of podcasting. So you can find out more about podcast coaching services and courses by visiting impactpodcastcoach.com. All right, what is a video podcast? So if you've been on YouTube recently and you've noticed that there is an entire tab, a section dedicated specifically to podcasts, then that's the new thing now. So although many of us have been podcasting and placing our audio podcasts on video on YouTube and other venues, YouTube is just now beginning to see the value of creating a whole dedicated section just for podcasters. So that's something you can look into. But a video podcast is simply a podcast with a video element. And typically when we think of podcasts, we think of audio, right? So you go to Apple Podcasts and you listen to an audio show, or you go to Spotify or a number of other places, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, Google Podcasts, and so forth. These are typically going to be audio format, but I do believe that in the near future, there will be a lot of these podcast hosting companies that understand the need for video and will start to incorporate video into their feed distribution. But some of the reasons why you would want to consider creating that video element and adding that to your podcast is that you're already doing a lot of the work. So for example, you're scripting. Some of you may create scripts. I do a 3-point, 4-point, 5-point talking script before I hop on the microphone and record. You're already doing that part of the work. You've already got the audio piece of it. You're already talking and recording your piece. So that's a good bit of it. And really the only additional thing that you don't have with the video is recording the video itself. So it just depends on what kind of video recording you want to do that will add to the labor. We're going to talk more in detail about what that means in just a moment. But secondly, another reason you may want to add video element is that it exposes you to a wider audience. So if you do have a video that accompanies your podcast or is a part of your episode, it's going to give you more leverage because you have more people that are able to watch your show and listen to your show. So YouTube is a prime example of that. Many of my episodes are audio only because it is quicker. And I didn't bother to get on camera for each of my episodes. But there have been a few recently that I decided I wanted to record as I'm talking, and just record it as though it was a live recording. So I did that on YouTube and found that it was kind of a 2-in-1 deal. So I've got my video and I would extract the audio from that video to get the audio portion of my podcast. So that is also another way to do that. But again, it exposes you to the YouTube platform and the algorithm of Google. So now that you're in YouTube, you've got that audience in addition to the audience that's already listening to you on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, for example. Thirdly, it's easier to convert your podcast to socials when you have video clips. So video clips are great because people like to see faces and video images. They like to see people talking. It's a lot more engaging for them. And so it just gives that sociability to your podcast when your audience can view clips of that podcast. Now let's talk about the different ways you can record video. And one of them is through in-studio recording. So that's when you and your guests are in a studio together with a camera recording you. A lot of the podcasts I listen to and watch are in this format. And although that it's not something that I do with my podcast, I find it really engaging and interesting to watch because everybody's in the same room. Now, that's not always possible. And in my particular case, and probably many of you, you are interviewing people that live way across on the other side of the world or in the nation somewhere else. So you're doing remote interviews. And the second way to record video then would be through a remote interview recording, such as Zoom or Riverside or Zencastr. So those are ways that you can capture the recording of you and your guest who is not in the same room as you. A third way to record video is through B-roll recording. And this is a combination of the standard recording plus a B-roll footage. Okay, so this is extra additional footage that you're recording. It takes a little extra work. It takes extensive editing as well because you have to go in and cut and splice and piece things together to actually accompany the audio so that the scenery, the visuals that your audience sees matches what you're saying on the audio. And you will have to purchase those video assets as well so that they are royalty-free video. So it's going to cost more and it's going to take more time to do the B-roll recording, but that is another option for getting video recorded. I don't recommend that if you're just starting out with podcasting because it is so much work. The fourth thing is static image recording. And that's when you just sort of plop an image on the screen with your interview or your podcast playing in the background. And that's not very visually engaging, but it is a lot quicker than the B-roll recording. And actually, I just did that on one of my recent episodes for Her Business Elevated podcast, episode number 38, I believe. And it was a lot of fun. So what I did was I placed several images, not just one, so that it would be more engaging and kind of appear like a slideshow. So I did an image for each aspect of what I was talking about on the show. So each of my outline topics, I created a new slide, and I did this in Canva. So if you'll go back and look at that episode, you'll see what I mean. I might leave a link to that in the show notes so that you can see an example of what I mean by that type of video recording for your podcast. But I basically already had the podcast recorded through audio, and I went back and just created a little slideshow for YouTube. And each of the slides had information about my topic and any images that would drive home my point better. So that's something you can look into doing if you feel like adding that video component is helpful. And again, if you just turn on your camera and start talking, that is probably the easiest way to gather video footage for your podcast. So if you're going to do a solo monologue like I'm doing right now, you could just have your camera on and take footage of that, just like you would if you were running a Facebook Live or an Instagram Live, and record that. And then you could extract that audio, just separate the video from the audio track and get the audio only for the purposes of your podcast distribution. So I'm going to go through a few steps of how to go about doing this. And the first thing you want to do is capture the recording. As we just mentioned, make sure you're able to capture this in the way that's best for you, whether it's sitting in front of your camera and recording it that way. You're talking, you give a monologue, you record both the audio and video at one time, and then you plan to separate the video from the audio track at a later time when you do your editing. Or you could capture the recording by having your guests that you're going to interview all together in a room with you, and you record that way as well. You can capture the recording by just speaking into your microphone and recording only your voice and then adding your images later or adding video assets later to create a video. And then once you've captured your recording, the second thing you're going to do is edit that video. So you'll need to take time to sit down or have your podcast editor edit out all the scenes, because now you're not just editing the audio, but you're editing the scenes. So if you have video, I recommend that you focus on getting your video to look just the way you need it to, finish editing the video, and then go back later after the video edits, and then just add on any additional audio effects and elements that you want at the end. Then the third thing you'll want to do is design your thumbnail image, because of course, if this is video, you'll want to have this in YouTube. So you'll want a thumbnail image so that your video looks attractive to the passerby who is scrolling through their YouTube to see what videos they want to see for the day. And if your image looks attractive and is calling to them, then they'll click and watch your podcast. So you never know how many people you will gain into your sphere of influence by adding your podcast to YouTube through a video. And so that thumbnail image is going to be an important aspect of that, of attracting your ideal audience. And then fourthly, you're just going to upload your video into YouTube. And I'm highly recommending YouTube because YouTube is Google, and we want to make sure that we're getting all of that search engine optimization juice going for our podcast. And I talked about SEO, I believe, in episode 13. So really important that if you're going to create video, you want to make sure that you definitely have your video uploaded to YouTube. That is pretty much the gist of how to turn your podcast into a video podcast. I know that there are some podcast hosting services that do accommodate video, and there are not many podcast hosting that will allow you to do that, but one of them is Podbean. I don't happen to use Podbean, and I'm not sponsored by Podbean, but I'm just letting you know that if this is something that you definitely want to do, is investing in the video aspect of your podcast, then check into Podbean hosting for your audio plus video, because they do offer unlimited video storage with their Unlimited Plus plan, and they offer seamless automatic upload to YouTube, Facebook, and other socials. My husband is currently using Podbean for his podcast, which he does a lot of lives on LinkedIn, and those lives are feeding directly into his Podbean so that they're automatically distributed. So that may be one way that you can sort of cut down on your having to do too many things, your processes and what gets hosted where. And so for that kind of seamless transition, and also the fact that Podbean is offering video storage hosting, it might be something that's applicable to your situation. But again, it's not necessary. You could simply use YouTube as your hosting and distribute your podcast through the typical audio only channels. But I do believe that in the future, like I said previously, that these hosting companies that have been audio only for all of these years are going to wake up to the fact that people want video hosting as well. And so they're going to start providing that. So that is my prediction, that pretty soon that's going to be a common thing, and Podbean probably won't be the only podcast hosting company that offers the service. So these are some things to look into. I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any suggestions about what you may want to hear about on this podcast, any questions about podcasting, I'd love to cover that on this show. So I try to keep some ongoing relevant content about podcasting in general, as well as encouragement for those of you who are just getting started with it. But I know that there are some technical things that you might want to know about. You may even have some guest recommendations, and I'd love to have some guests on the show pretty soon. I just wanted to do my first 20 episodes with just me and you guys as you listen in on the show, because I wanted to let you know my heart about how important podcasting has been for me, what it means to me, and how I want to be that help for you. But I would love to get some guests on the show to talk more about the different aspects of running a podcast. So that's all I have for you on this episode. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, happy podcasting.